For nearly 2,000 years, one detail about the man who sentenced Jesus to death was strange enough that skeptics never let it go. Outside the pages of the New Testament, not one piece of physical evidence existed anywhere in the world that Pontius Pilate had ever been real. No inscription. No coin bearing his name. Nothing you could hold in your hand and point to. Then, in June of 1961, a team clearing rubble from an old Roman theater flipped over a broken step. The man only the Bible named. Pontius Pilate governed Judea from roughly AD 26 to 36 and appears prominently in all four Gospels as the Roman official who condemned Jesus to crucifixion. He also appears in the Jewish historian Josephus and the philosopher Philo, both writing within decades of his life, and in the Roman historian Tacitus, writing around AD 116. To be precise about what that means, serious historians never seriously doubted Pilate was a real man. Josephus, Philo, and Tacitus all wrote about him as a matter of fact, within a century of his life. What they never had was anything physical, a contemporary object, carved or minted during his own lifetime, confirming his existence outside of someone else's later written account. That absence, real and genuine, is what fueled 2,000 years of the same pointed question from skeptics of the Gospels. If the most detailed, dramatic scene in the Gospels involves a man who left no trace of himself anywhere in the physical record, what else in that scene might be embellished, invented, or simply unverifiable? Why the silence mattered. For critics of the Gospel's historical reliability, this absence was a useful talking point. If a figure this central to the crucifixion narrative had left no archaeological trace at all, it fed a broader argument that the Gospel writers may have taken creative liberties with historical detail, inflating or inventing the specifics of Roman administration to suit their narrative purposes. This is a fair question to ask of any ancient text. It is also, as of 1961, a question with a direct physical answer: what Josephus remembered about him. Before the stone was ever found, the Jewish historian Josephus had already given the world a detailed, independent portrait of Pilate as governor, one that lines up strikingly with the man the Gospels describe. Josephus records that Pilate brought Roman military standards bearing the emperor's image into Jerusalem at night, provoking a massive crowd protest, because Jewish law forbade such graven images in the holy city. Pilate eventually backed down rather than risk the unrest escalating further. Josephus also records that Pilate funded an aqueduct using money taken from the Jewish temple treasury, triggering riots he crushed with soldiers disguised among the crowd. Years later, after a brutal crackdown on a Samaritan gathering, Pilate was recalled to Rome to answer for his conduct. This is a governor sensitive to public unrest, capable of provocative decisions, and ultimately willing to use force or make concessions depending on which kept his own position secure. That is exactly the character the Gospels portray during Jesus' trial, a man weighing the crowd's anger against his own political survival. Two entirely independent sources, neither one influenced by the other, describing the same kind of man. The stone found face down. In June 1961, an Italian archaeological team led by Antonio Frova was excavating the ancient Roman theater at Caesarea Maritima, the coastal city Herod the Great built on the Mediterranean. Archaeologist Maria Teresa Fortuna Canavet found a limestone block, roughly 82 centimeters high, that had been reused centuries earlier as a step in a staircase. The inscribed face had been placed downward, into the ground. That single detail, likely accidental, is precisely what preserved the carved letters from centuries of wind, rain, and foot traffic that had erased so much else from the ancient world around it. What survived the damage? The stone had been damaged when it was repurposed. Roughly half the original inscription was chiseled away to fit its new use as a step. What remains, reconstructed by scholars from the surviving fragments, reads, "To the divine Augusti, this Tiberium, Pontius Pilatus, prefect of Judea, has dedicated it." A Tiberium was very likely a temple or public building dedicated to the Emperor Tiberius. Pilate had commissioned it, and had his own name and title carved into its dedication stone. sometime during his decade governing the province. The title that didn't match. Here is the detail scholars found most valuable. The stone identifies Pilate specifically as praefectus, prefect. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing decades later, called him procurator instead. This is not a contradiction that undermines the evidence. It is the opposite. Prefect was the correct, earlier title used for governors of Judea during Pilate's actual time in office. Procurator became the standard title only after administrative reforms under a later emperor, Claudius. Tacitus, writing generations afterward, was using the title current in his own day, projected backward onto an earlier period, a common and understandable habit among ancient historians. The stone, carved during Pilate's own lifetime, preserves the historically correct title. This is exactly the kind of precise, verifiable detail a fabricated inscription would be unlikely to get right, and exactly the kind of detail that gives historians real confidence in the artifact's authenticity. What a forgery would get wrong. It is worth spelling out exactly why the title mismatch matters so much to historians evaluating authenticity. A forger working at any point after Pilate's own lifetime, whether in antiquity, the medieval period, or the modern era, would almost certainly have used procurator, since that became the standard, widely known title for Judean governors in every later Roman source available to copy from. Using the earlier, more obscure, and by later standards technically outdated title of prefect is not the kind of error a forger makes. It is the kind of detail that only survives if the object was actually produced during the narrow window when that title was still current, Pilate's own decade in office. The stone passes a test of fabrication would very likely have failed. Not the only precise detail. The Pilate Stone is not an isolated case of the New Testament getting small Roman administrative details right. Acts chapter 13 calls Sergius Paulus, the Roman official on Cyprus, a proconsul, the correct title for that specific province, confirmed by other independent inscriptions. Acts chapter 17 uses the unusual term politarchs for local officials in Thessalonica, a title once dismissed by critics as a Lucan invention, until inscriptions using that exact term were found in the region. A pattern emerges across multiple books, multiple authors, and multiple decades, when these texts name a Roman official's specific title, and that title can be independently checked against archaeology. It tends to hold up. That is not what loose legend typically produces. It is what careful, informed reporting produces. What this doesn't prove. Intellectual honesty requires stating plainly what the Pilate Stone does not do. It does not verify the specific events of Jesus' trial. It does not confirm the dialogue recorded in the Gospels word for word. It is not, by itself, proof that every detail of the crucifixion narrative is historically precise. What it does establish, beyond reasonable dispute, is that Pontius Pilate was a real Roman official, governing Judea with the specific title the Gospels imply, during precisely the window of time the Gospels describe. The man at the center of the most consequential trial in history was not a literary invention. He held a real office, in a real place, and left his name carved in stone to prove it. There is a broader principle worth noting here. When ancient texts get small, independently checkable details right, the correct title of a minor provincial official, confirmed by a stone that sat buried for 19 centuries, that consistency earns real credibility for how carefully those texts were assembled overall. It does not prove every detail elsewhere. It does demonstrate the writers were not working from loose legend. They were recording something closer to careful, verifiable history. The man who judged the judge. John's Gospel records the exact moment Pilate stood in front of the truth itself and asked, "What is truth?" He had the authority to investigate, to question, to demand evidence, the same authority that carved his name permanently into a stone dedication. And when truth stood directly in front of him, he asked a question instead of receiving an answer. The stone that confirms Pilate's existence also confirms something else worth sitting with. A real, historical, Verifiable man once stood face to face with Jesus Christ and had every opportunity to recognize exactly who was in front of him. He asked his question, then walked away from the answer standing right there. Matthew records that Pilate washed his hands in front of the crowd, declaring himself innocent of the decision he had just made. It is a striking irony that the same administrative precision that carved his name permanently into stone for future verification could not produce a clear verdict when the truth itself was standing in front of him, waiting for an honest answer instead of a symbolic gesture. You have more evidence available to you today than Pilate had standing in that courtroom. Evidence Pilate's own dedication stone now helps confirm. The question he failed to sit with is the same one still waiting for an honest answer from anyone who encounters it. What is truth? And what will you do when it is standing directly in front of you? A stone, turned face down in the dirt for 19 centuries, outlasted the empire that carved it and confirmed the man history almost lost to silence. The trial he presided over needed no such confirmation. It changed everything regardless of whether anyone ever found his name. I invite you to subscribe and join us as we journey together through the pages of Scripture, discovering not only what happened, but why it still matters today. Thank you for listening, and until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Shalom.